thanks for being here today. I would like to welcome everyone to the 11th edition of the Global Corporate Governance Colloquium here at Imperial, and to welcome to Imperial, it's my pleasure to have Ian Walmsley here today, our Provost. So Ian.
Cláudia, thank you very much. And I would just like to welcome everybody to Imperial. First, I know you've come from many, many places around the world, and I know that can be increasingly challenging these days. So thank you for coming and joining us here. And congratulations on the longevity of this colloquium. Clearly, the fact that it continues going from strength to strength is an indication of the durability of the themes that you are always debating. And I'm sure now is as timely a moment as any to be considering what governance looks like in the corporate sector. No doubt you will, like all of us, be thinking about how to adapt to the volatility of the situation. And no doubt, like Imperial, you'll be thinking about how the values of your organizations play into that role. The global nature of this conference fits very well with the global perspectives of Imperial, and we're delighted to be able to host you here. We have more than 60% of our students from around the world, and the perspectives that they bring are a valuable part of our educational mission, and of course about our own ideation and innovation activities too. Our interactions too with industry and with corporations and indeed with governments and other partners perform a vital element of Imperial's intellectual vibrancy and indeed the way in which we see our impact in the world. So the sorts of things that you are thinking about here have a very great resonance with our own activity. And it's great that we can be engaged with you in thinking about these things. You have come at the most marvelous time of the year in London, and I hope that you get a chance to visit some of our neighbors if you have a few moments too. We sit on the legacy of the Great Exhibition of 1851. In fact, the Royal Commission established out of that is our landlord. So you're sitting on property that we don't actually own as a college. But the vision for that, I think, holds a resonance for today. The combination of culture, of technology, of science and arts are things that will be important in human future. And we hope that the sorts of things that you're debating also will help resonate and build those sorts of structures. So you have a marvelous agenda. I've looked at it. I only understand a fraction of the sort of things you'll talk about. But I wish you a great few days and a very fruitful set of debates. And I'll look with great anticipation at the conclusions you come to see if you can help us all navigate through what is an increasingly uncertain world. So have a wonderful conference and colloquium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. Okay. So before we move on to our exciting program, there is a few housekeeping details to go through. Just to let you know, probably the most important thing is that no fire alarm is scheduled for today. So if you hear a fire alarm, you will have to run. And yes, and I think that's probably the most relevant thing. So without further ado, indeed, we have a great program ahead of us. And we'll start very soon with, with Elizabeth Pollman. Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to welcome Dan up. We're going to start our first session. We have some high energy folks for the first session, Elaine and Marco and Suzanne, the whole team, they really know how to put together a program with all of the GCGC schools. We're going to have 2 papers in this session. Each paper will have a discussant, followed by Q&A. And one important note on the Q&A that I'll kindly remind you is that we need everybody to speak into a microphone when they're asking a question. So once we get to Q&A, which I hope there will be a lively discussion, so already please start to get thinking about getting on the queue. And know that we'll want to be on the microphones. So without further ado, to give the most time possible, over to Dan Puchniak.
Thank you very much. It's always a huge honor and pleasure to come here. I think this is year 11. And I just need to thank, of course, the GCGC's changed over the years, but Elaine is still here, and she's and brought in family with Suzanne, and it's a wonderful team, a wonderful conference. I also have to really thank my co-authors, Zhou and Zhang Wei. I start in a weird place, maybe, which is my jogging route. And 2 weeks ago, I was jogging, and I couldn't resist to take this picture. And you won't maybe guess where this is, unless you know China well. It's the West Lake in Hangzhou. And what is strange about it is it's in the middle of a city of 12 million people. It's actually the birthplace of DeepSeek. And when I was there, I thought it would add interesting context to tell you that I presented this paper twice. And I actually had to submit my slides, which I understood were reviewed. And it was interesting that all of the slides that I'll show you today were actually reviewed, and I showed the same slides. And some of the slides that I'll start with, I was quite surprised that they were shown. There was one slide I was suggested to change. Yeah? I won't tell you which one, and we can talk about that in the discussion period. So with that sort of out of the way, I start the paper where it should be started, which is the first sentence of the paper, which says, China is known in the West for many things. However, a rules-based market for shareholder activism is not one of them. What do we hear about China? We hear that President Xi Jinping is infamous in the West for demanding that businesses conform to the Communist Party. The new head of the regulator of China, the equivalent to the SEC in the United States, has been given the sobriquet broker butcher for a crackdown on stockbrokers over a decade ago. You, of course, hear about billionaires disappearing and then, quite interestingly, reappearing, not really knowing what happened to them in between. And this is what we hear. And when you think about this, this is not exactly an environment in which one would expect to find a vibrant market for shareholder activism, especially shareholder activism where the target company is the Chinese state. Prior to this research, there was really no, and we've looked quite hard, detailed analysis of shareholder activism in China. Of course, the literature on activism is huge, but it's quite interesting because we're dealing with the second largest equity market in the world, and at least in the legal sphere, and in English or Chinese, this discussion didn't exist. Maybe because the assumption was that it either was non-existent or that it was marginal. In terms of the Western literature in the past, the assumption has always been that minority shareholders in China, to give some quotes, were passive and politically disempowered. A recent very good PhD project, actually done by a terrific scholar at NUS and published in the Columbia Journal of Transnational Law, said that institutional investors were passive. And they were passive due to political pressure. There's also been some terrific scholarship, and we have people in the room like Curtis Milhop, who have dissected the political channels of power that the CCP uses. And this is very valuable work. Yeah? But as we say in our paper, most of the literature has been looking at the political channel. And we use the line and the analogy about the hammer and nail, right? If you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you only look for politics, maybe everything starts to look political. And the idea is that maybe we found something more. And then we get to this chart, okay? And this is my co-author, Zhou Chung at Zhejiang University in Hangzhou. I have to give all the credit to her. She had a group of students who went, and in the paper we go into the details about how this data was collected, which I don't have the time to go into right now. But interestingly, what do you see? You see that 2007, why? That's the split share reform. Essentially, this is when you start getting a liquid market. That's our starting time. And even early on, right, it's quite interesting. Even if you stopped in 2017, it's still quite impressive because the idea is you don't have these campaigns at all. But nobody could look at this chart and not notice 2018, boom, right? You're getting a lot of activism. Okay, and the question is, what is activism? And I say it's extraordinary because it's ordinary. Okay, and it is putting a director on the board in opposition to management. It is exercising majority of minority vote, okay, when you're opposing management. You don't see a lot of litigation. It's maybe because it's not that developed. Okay, but the bottom line is we have a lot of activism going on, and the activism is not that surprising in that it's what you would see maybe anywhere else. There is something in the paper we bring up, and this relates to another paper I have with Lin Lin at the National University of Singapore, which I don't think many people realize, which is that there has been a concerted effort by the Chinese government to develop institutional investors in China. So I have a paper from 2003 with Lin Lin, and it's quite amazing, right? If you go back to 2003, it's 1% of the market is institutional investors. You go up to 20%, free float, you have 50% now institutional investors. You don't hear much about this in the literature. Everything is about the SOE. Why? In my mind, it's because BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, Big Three, less than 1%. So who are these people? That's another paper, but it relates to this paper because these institutional investors, which are locally based, are engaged in activism. Of course, there's private ones and there's state ones. Another thing that people are often shocked about is how shareholder-centric the Chinese law is. Okay, shareholders have a lot of power for the lawyers in the room, okay, especially compared to the US, but the US isn't a great comparator because the US is very board-centric, right? But even compared to other places, and in the recent iteration of the New Companies Act, they lowered the barriers for shareholder proposals. They put in a double derivative action. They expanded inspection rights. Okay, so this is a very robust regulatory system. Again, the opposite of what people would suggest. But the elephant in the room, right, is this. In these activist campaigns, when the government is the activist, because the shareholders are either private or government. Government is divided into national, the most powerful, and municipal and provincial. When they're the activists, do they always win? Especially when they're facing a private party. When a private party attacks an SOE, especially a national one, are they going to win? I think the general sentiment, especially in the popular media, okay, would be that, of course, they're going to, if they're the activists, they'll win. If they're the target, the private's going to lose. What do we find? We find the opposite. We find, in fact, that there's no statistically significant evidence that there's an advantage for private parties or the government. We also find that private shareholders undertake, and more often than not, in more than half of the cases succeeded, in activist campaigns against so-called national champions, the biggest SOEs at a national level. 78% of activist campaigns against national champions were in fact brought by private shareholders, 57% of which succeeded. How about on the other side of the coin? Over 50% of activist campaigns launched by the state, not at the local level, the powerful national level shareholder, When they face a private firm, it failed. Okay, I didn't expect to find this. More interestingly for me was reading the case studies. So at the back end of the paper, the business school people will be unimpressed. Yeah, maybe you're, because we go through these case studies in detail, okay? And so the front end is empirical, the back end are these case studies. I shouldn't say unimpressed, yeah? Maybe business school people are the best at case studies. So maybe I need to give due credit. So, you know, it's very interesting though. Why? Because these case studies, what do we find? We found one case study where a government shareholder shows up against a private firm, and the private firm doesn't let them vote their shares. Then they do what? I thought before this research project, what's going to happen? That person is going to end up wherever Jack Ma was. But what happens? No, they complain to the provincial regulator, securities regulator. The securities regulator writes a letter to the company saying you're not following the corporate law rules. The company still says, we're not allowing you to exercise your rights under the law. Then what happens? The government takes them to court. And of course, the government won. But this is not what you expect to find in the Chinese context. Then we found something, and I love, if you haven't watched Dumb Money, I'm a huge fan of Dumb Money. Yeah. Everybody knows about Roaring Kitty. But have you heard of Legend of the Red Scarf? Legend of the Red Scarf is China's Roaring Kitty that we uncovered in this project. They organize on a site called Snowball. Snowball is the equivalent to Reddit. They challenged Costco. Costco is the biggest dry bulk shipper in the world. It's a state-owned enterprise. And they forced the payment of a dividend in the campaign. Fascinating. This map, why do I have this map up? I have this map up to just remind us how large and complex China is. The flags represent the populations of countries, and these are the Chinese provinces. What did we find? We found state activist shareholders attacking another province's SOE. Of course, all of this could have been worked out in a back room, but it wasn't. They used the legal tools. They used the company law. They used the securities law. And this is a very interesting, an additional research project. This state-on-state activism showing the complexity of the Chinese government. Where did we find statistically significant results? We found them only where the larger stake the activist owns, the higher percentage of shares, the more likely they are to succeed in the campaign. Exactly what you would expect to find in a rules-based system. That was the only result. I'll show the results soon. We also, of course, saw that in 2019, when you get this spike, there's a regulatory change that takes place to increase shareholder activism in the corporate governance code. We did find also something else that would hint at a rules-based system, which is that successful campaigns were more likely, but it was not on a statistically significant basis, to succeed in campaigns where their target has a lower ROA, which you would expect. Underperforming firms, you're more likely to succeed in a campaign. So you can see the success rates, the only statistically significant success rates where there's a statistically significant correlation is with the percentage of share ownership. There are some politics going on. I want to stress this a lot. We are not saying that politics is not important. The Chinese Communist Party, as I'll show you in the next slide, is very powerful. What we are saying is that when you look at these campaigns, they're allowing them to go ahead based on the rules. We found one case, which we dissect in the paper, where we do think that there was possible political interference, but this was one case out of 156. The overall message, right, well, I should say actually the other interesting political fact, and this is wonderful because, you know, when you run your empirical tests, of course you can only put into your test the data that appears. But there was one piece of missing data in terms of campaigns. And this was local, state, activist shareholders, so municipal and provincial, never even attempted, never mind succeed, never even attempted a campaign against a national champion. It's an absent feature in our data. We infer from this that there is still a political hierarchy, that if you're a municipal or provincial shareholder, of course, this is just our intuition for the gap in the data, that you simply don't go there, right? So this is my power slide, yeah? I provide some nice animation. Yeah. So what am I saying here, okay? I'm saying that the CCP is in fact quite smart. You have BYDs, okay, for a reason. You have DeepSeek for a reason. You have the best solar panels in the world for a reason, okay? If you love free markets, I think this is a good newspaper. And my Chinese co-authors were a bit worried when I put up this as the last sentence in our paper. I said, there is a reason why the USSR regularly had shortages of toilet paper and why it did not have shareholder activism. China has an abundance of both. Yeah. So I think the story here is that, of course, as we know today, if you read the papers, US Steel, Nippon Steel, governments everywhere play some role, and sometimes they do reach into corporate control and power. The question is, how often do they do it? Is it in every AGM? Or are they wise enough to step back and say, we have our corporate law rules, and we generally let them play out in cases that are not hugely contentious, right? And what we have uncovered here is that, in fact, all the evidence in China suggests that that is the case for the observable cases. Of course, we can only look at observable cases. There's a whole area of unobservable, which you deal with every time that you research activism, okay, which is much harder to get at. In terms of the future is, in our estimation, and I hate to predict the future because Professor Kim and I, we wrote something on independent directors once, and I said, independent directors, there's no end in sight. And I have another paper that I just am putting out. Indonesia got rid of their independent directors the year after we said it, yeah. So I hate to predict the future, yeah. But if you look at the Companies Act, which just came out, shareholder proposals, which is the main strategy that are used, drops from 3% to 1% in the recent act. Inspection rights expanding. Double derivative actions putting in. So what do we see? I think this portends a future where you're going to have more of this. Okay, and when I was in China a few weeks ago presenting this paper, I talked to many lawyers, and they consistently said that, of course, if our clients are dissatisfied with management, if they think there's going to be wealth tunneling, they come to us, we go to court, we do what we can. We're not ignorant of the politics. Most cases it's not an issue, sometimes it is. But most of the time, we use our rules. These are economic, right? And the roaring kitty, we're doing more on Legend of the Red Scarf. Yeah. 100 million to 200 million retail investors in China. There's a lot to research there. And with that, I don't have time now, yeah, to explain which slide I had to change. Maybe we can talk about that in the coffee break. But I just thank you very much for this forum, and I hope that there is a robust discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was Dan Puchniak from Singapore Management University, as you all know. I'm assuming you're following along in the program, everyone. I'm not going to do long introductions, but to welcome Joon Chung from Seoul National University up for discussion.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. When I realized that from this conference, the discussion time will be reduced in half, from 20 minutes to 10 minutes, I thought that, oh, it'll be maybe too short to make a real discussion. But when I realized that I'll be commenting on Dan's paper, I was quite relieved because his paper was complete enough. So if I was given 20 minutes, it will be difficult for me to fill out the full discussion time. So as Dan said, maybe the key point of his paper is contrary to Western assumptions, China has developed a rule-based market for shareholder activism, and there is no evidence of systemic political interference even when state actors are involved. So I made a heat chart based on his data, which is that if you look at here, you have target company, private-owned companies, and then you have local-owned, state-owned enterprises and central. And here you have activists classified by private, local, and central. Obviously, as you can see, there are many activist cases where private activists go against a private-owned target. But as you can see here, there are also many cases where SOEs are involved. And looking at the heat map of on my right, the success ratio of private versus public is really something neutral. So if we can prove that maybe SOEs are much more powerful than POEs in each cases, this map should be something like here you'll be less success ratio, while the other side there will be a higher success ratio. But as you can see here, the proportion of success ratio is quite even, which means that political influence in actual cases may not be that high. So as Dan said, one of the very important observations that we can see about the recent China corporate law is that they are adopting a very shareholder-centric model, but which is under the supervision of the party. So for example, they have amended their company law in 2024. They have enhanced minority rights, such as shareholder proposal, derivative lawsuits, very strong inspection right from the minority side and things like that. And they even have a explicit statute that obligates controlling shareholders to buy out, to purchase the shares of minorities when there's abuse from controller side. And you have the Security Regulatory Commission, which is equivalent to SEC in the United States, and they are emphasizing more dividends, which is a quite explicit announcement from the regulatory, and which is really a fascinating and exciting item from a corporate law professor side is that they have established a company called China Securities Investor Services Center, who are doing actually, this is a government entity, but they are exercising their shareholder right on behalf of minority shareholders. As you know, I think the United States is the only places where there are many derivative lawsuits. Many other countries, they have derivative lawsuits in their law, but it's not actively exercised. While here, this public company is kind of doing that role on behalf of the minority shareholder. But on the same time, this goes hand in hand with the party's influence. So for example, if you look at their company act, there's a clause saying that the party organization should be established within every company. And also in the section 19 of the Company Act, they said the company needs to accept supervision from the government and the public, which is something that this is difficult to find out in other countries. So in sum, I can understand that maybe China is using shareholderism as a tool to achieve policy goals. So for example, according to Dan's work 4 years ago, maybe the rise of institutional investors in China has been done in a way to reinforce the party's ultimate control, like common prosperity or things like that. But is it something bad that the government or law has an intention? I don't think so, because looking at the example of East Asia, in Japan and Korea, we are seeing a very obvious movement to a shareholderism, which is quite contrary to what's happening in the West. So for example, in Japan, there has been a decade of corporate reform. You may have heard about Abenomics. They have adopted stewardship court, corporate governance code. And the Tokyo Stock Exchange, who is the generous sponsor of our conference, they have increased shareholder return by disclosure and market restructuring. And similar things is also happening in Korea. So we have adopted what we call value up program, which emphasizes disclosure on cost on equity, return on equity, and things like that. And we have now a new government after the notorious martial law that you may heard last December. And there are planned amendment of commercial code to specify duty of loyalty towards shareholders. So if you look at the shareholder activism activities in Japan and Korea, so I understand that Japan is number 2 in terms of shareholder activities after United States, and Korea maybe number 3 or number 4, and you can see this dynamic increase of cases in shareholder activism. So this is the general trend, what's happening in East Asia. So as I said, it was really difficult to find out any helpful comments for a complete paper, but just adding my 2 cents. So in his data set, there's only 25% target, which is SOEs. So maybe we may think that there's too small number of SOEs compared to private-owned enterprises, which means that still maybe political influence has something to do in China. And they reject this possibility based on the following reasons. One is that there's no significant difference between the return on assets of SOEs and POE target, which means that these companies are bad enough to get shareholder activism actions. And the second argument is that the proportion of SOE and POE, which is 25 versus 75, is almost same with targeted company in their data set. But I propose to maybe look at this point, which is that maybe state-owned enterprises in China need more shareholder activism than is now, because if you look at the price-to-book ratio of the red graph is about, it's an index called CSI private-owned enterprises, which include all listed company in China, all private-owned institution in China, while the blue line represents for CSI SOE index, which is the PB ratio for state-owned enterprise. As you can see, there's still a big differences about performance. So SOEs are underperforming substantially compared to private-owned enterprises. And also, if you look at the index as well, the red line is much better performing than the blue line, which means that maybe we need more activism for SOEs. And the second point is that despite the number of SOEs is only 1/3 of POEs, the market share, the total market revenue and the market profit is much, much larger compared to POEs, which means that they have more influence in Chinese economy. So once again, I think that instead of just comparing the number of target company versus all listed company, maybe you can think of looking at the profitability and importance of these SOEs in Chinese market. So this is my end of discussion. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Joon, for that excellent discussion of some fascinating research by Dan. I'm going to welcome Dan to give a brief response if you'd like to. Brief, because I'm going to also start taking your hands for the cue. Hold them up until I kind of nod at you, because I can see some hands going up. Yeah. Dan, over to you.
Yeah, so very briefly, thank you very much for the great comments, and maybe I'll address the last one about underperforming SOEs, right, which I think is very insightful. So there is a great need, I think, and the Chinese government realizes there's a great need to address this problem. And I have no doubt in the Legend of the Red Scarf case, where investors were discussing on Snowball, okay, the Chinese Reddit, that the Chinese government could have flipped a switch to shut down that discussion quickly. Why do I think this? I'm actually from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I was very sad because Winnipeg is famous for nothing, except Winnie the Pooh. And all of a sudden, Winnie the Pooh disappeared from China because Xi Jinping was being made fun of because of Winnie the Pooh. And so if they can get rid of Winnie the Pooh with flip of the switch, they can surely flip the switch on Snowball. But the point is that they realize that this is in line with their agenda, right? We track in the paper that the government, because the stock market hasn't been doing well, they don't want companies, especially these big SOEs, sitting on piles of cash, okay? And this is a different lever that they can use to get the cash out, right? So they have their policies, they put pressure on them from one side, okay? And then though, which is interesting in the evolution of China, that sometimes they put this pressure and it doesn't immediately work, and you use from the other side, right, which is this ground up activism. And so they know that the SOEs need to be kept on their toes, and I think that this is absolutely right. These SOEs need more activism, and that's why they're amending the law the way they amended.
Wonderful. So I have Curtis Milhaupt, Anat Admati, John Morley. I think I saw Sir and Gamsian, and then I'm going to get some more. So first, Curtis, with the mic.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Very cool paper. You and I have talked about it a lot. So just basically to repeat a point or a suggestion I made some time ago, which is a lot of the empirics rest on this kind of blunt hierarchy between central, local, and SOEs and POEs. There's a line of literature that uses political connections as a way to actually get at the level of political influence of companies, which is more nuanced. Of course, it has shortcomings too, but I would really suggest that you take advantage of that. Now, you'll have to, I think the activism takes off in 2017, so you'll have a couple of years where you can just pull this off the WIND database. WIND has shut this down. They don't any longer provide this data, so you'll have to manually collect it, but you only have 100-some companies in your data sets. It's not that big a deal. And it would be really interesting to see how that data, what happens to your results if you use that measure of political influence as opposed to this, very blunt hierarchy. Because as you know, this has always been a blurry distinction, and it's becoming much blurrier in China. So I think that would be, if nothing else, be really interesting to see what happens to your results.
Hi. Part of what I was going to
I can respond, or
I think we'll take a couple.
We'll take a couple
I got
first.
4 more on the queue. So
okay, just take, run
them.
them.
Yeah, so going even broader into the politics, shareholder activism and everything about shareholders sits in the context of all the numerous other laws, and we see now in the US, and certainly it's true in China, that there are many, many levers to the government. So the question really is, in the broader picture, which lever does the government care to use versus, the shareholder game that they would play illegitimately, but, sort of, where do you place the entire, because you didn't talk at all about which issues were on the table, what was the debate, did you classify them into any kind of specific context of what the activism was really about, and therefore, how does it fit in with other government action, other corporate action, other things? So it was very hard to know what to make.
Dan, do you want to respond briefly?
Sure. So I guess to Curtis's point first, so it's a good suggestion. The data is difficult. It has to be hand collected, but we do have a reasonable number of cases. So, I take your point on that. The only tiny bit of pushback that I would give is just that it seems that there is some more recent literature which suggests that, the difference, and there's that paper, NUS scholars that we cite in our paper, which actually shows that the distinction between SOE and POE recently, and there we have more recent data, is actually quite meaningful, right? But I admit that it's not perfect, right? In no country is it perfect. There's always going to be some leeway. But even I don't know if you would agree with my statement about your paper, which is more nuanced than saying they're identical, right? So I think that there's a meaningful difference. When Trump decides to take in Nippon Steel his golden share, okay, that is going to be far different than if he doesn't take the golden share, right? And so I think everybody can agree on that fact, but I completely agree. More tests and comparing the two is an excellent suggestion. The point that you made is a very good one, and I can briefly address it, which is that I was at King's College yesterday. Unfortunately, my slides were all white yesterday, but it was nicer today. But it was about ESG. Okay, what is very interesting is this activism, there wasn't one case that was an ESG case. Okay, so this is all financial. It doesn't mean that corporate governance and ESG isn't going on in China, but it's at least they're not using the lever for this. And what seems to be the case is especially on this payment of dividends, interfering with related party transactions, with wealth tunneling. So we're talking about financial governance problems, okay, maybe also linking up to corrupt management or at least wealth tunneling problems. So it is very financial, and that distinguishes it. You also see this in Korea, and Joon and I have talked with Gen Goto about this because we're looking at a possible project, as you can anticipate, on East Asia shareholder activism, and you don't seem to find as much of the social activism that you found elsewhere. A tiny bit in Japan, but a lot of that is from foreign institutional investors. So a good question, but I think it's financial, just to answer it directly.
Excellent. We're going to go to John Morley and then over to Søren.
Two quick questions. The first is, do you think it's possible that the government is tacitly encouraging this behind the scenes? That is to say, these private activists, are they popping up not accidentally, but through the encouragement of the government? And the second observation is that it's a little bit challenging to interpret the success rates here for the same reasons it's challenging to interpret the significance of success rates in litigation, right? You only bring a contest if you expect to succeed, and if the success rate is high enough, then maybe you don't bring a contest at all because you just win in advance. There's a kind of priest-kind problem.
Søren.
It's, the comment is related to earlier point because you present this as a private against state-owned, but I wonder whether it's possible that within the Communist Party there are different power towers or power centers, and each of these companies is associated or linked to one, and these activism campaigns are actually struggles, fights between these towers. And my analogy is Russia. Before the war in Ukraine, there was this story that within Kremlin there are two towers and every company is linked to them. Everything is done based on the law, looks like rules-based, but actually it's strongly influenced, and the outcome actually depends which power center at the end is more influential.
And we've got such an active queue. We're going to take another one from Adri Robertson.
Well, my thought was actually very similar to John's, which is, I'd be really, and this is not meant as a criticism of the paper, but rather just a question, and I think it would help inform my understanding of your results, which is, should we think of this as, you mentioned, there's problems with tunneling and sort of like corruption within these companies, and there's been a general anti-corruption crackdown more broadly in China, for example. So you might think that perhaps these activists are being encouraged by the central government to do this. In other words, should we think of this as co-option? Or should we think of this as competition with the government? And either answer is super interesting, but it is a very different story. And it's certainly not the same story of private attacking government versus, government using private to go after other government. So I would be very interested in what you found there.
Great. And Dan, I'll just add that I was thinking along the lines of John and Adri, that I also wondered, in the US, there's a fair bit of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. It's very hard for empirical observation. So I wonder also what we're not seeing that could be different in flavor. Would you like to take a moment to respond to any of that batch of questions?
Sure. Yeah. All wonderful questions. So I guess starting with John, and there's some overlap as well. So whether or not it's accidental, okay, I don't think that it is accidental, but of course this is the first paper, right? Before there was nothing on shareholder activism at all. So we have several papers that are going to flow out of this. There's a lot more to examine, and this is one of the questions that we're looking at, right? The exact question you asked. I'll give you my intuition, which is that I think a lot of the activism has clearly fall into line. 2018-19, where you see this spike, is the same time they amended the corporate governance code to try to get shareholders more active. They put out many directives for dividend payouts. So this is not accidental. Whether Legend of the Red Scarf, I don't know, right, is connected. It's impossible with the amount of research we've done, and this being the first sort of scoping paper of this, to give a definitive answer. But I think it is very clear from the amendment of the New Companies Act, which was the biggest amendment in well over a decade, that they really want more of this to go on. Why would you increase inspection rights? Why would you lower proposals from 3% to 1%? Why would you put in double derivative actions? So they want this to go on. It is going on. They set up a separate agency to actually bring derivative actions with only one chair. So this is all clear. So it is not accidental. I think this is by design. Success. We had a lot of talk about success. Okay, it is very difficult to measure because, as you say, it's terrible to measure. And we tried to address this in our paper by going from the empirical to the case study. Why? Because, for instance, let's just take one strategy, which is putting a director onto the board. That's your objective in your activist campaign. In China, it's interesting because with 30%, it's mandatory cumulative voting for listed companies. Okay, so you have a very strong right there. So let's say that's your objective. We coded it as a success if you get your director on the board, which is logical. But then we tried to gather information afterwards to see, is this person kicked off the board in 6 months or are they ineffective? Okay, but you can't do your empirical work that way because it never ends, right? So you have to have hard criteria, but then we did as much as we could to follow up, which is why we have the case studies at the end where we uncovered this one case where we actually saw a quote-unquote success, which was never implemented in this Hongqi, which is red flag, the very politically powerful company that makes sort of the Rolls-Royce of China and is connected to the government. And we call that out in the paper.
Dan,
right?
I know
Yes.
you want to respond more to what you heard, but I also want to add a bit more to this. So we have Holger Spahman, Jennifer Hill, Uma Converadel, and Marco Beck to round us out. So if those four could be brief, we'll fit them all in.
I'll try to be very brief. Seconding Adri and John that it's really an equilibrium outcome and you're just seeing the frontier and that's sort of, and you're already hinting towards that. So taking a different perspective on that, the way, when you say rule-based activism, I think Elliot coming in and just insisting on every little tiny bit of the details of the rules, brutally enforcing them in the courts. And my suspicion is Elliot is not active in China, and my suspicion is if they were, they would lose if they used their tactics from the United States. They might adapt because they're very smart. Maybe they would try to play the game, but they probably understand that they wouldn't be good at that game given their connections. And so in some sense, this is not a criticism of your article. I find it fascinating, but I think who am I telling this to you? You know, it looks somewhat similar. We can call it activism, but it's really a different animal from what we see in, and maybe this goes for every jurisdiction, but certainly if you compare to the United States.
Thank you, Holger. I saw a lot of nods around the room on that one. Jennifer Hill.
Yeah, thanks. I think my question probably relates to what Adriana was saying. On the surface, this dividend forcing seems so much like the situation in Japan pre-2014 with the beginning of Abenomics and the adoption of a stewardship code. But of course, it plays out differently in China because, as you've said, it's not external institutional investors that are doing the activism. It's somehow been, brought inside China. And I just wonder, those starting points, if it is dividend forcing, why were the Chinese sitting on the mountains of cash in the way that the Japanese were? Or is it really much more nuanced where you've got all this corruption and tunnelling as well, which I would assume wasn't the problem in Japan? So I'm just interested in the Japan-China contrast.
Thank you, Jennifer. Uma Converadel.
So Dan, just a couple of quick questions. One is, if you could speak a little bit more about the nature of the activism, it could be shareholder proposals, it could be derivative actions. And linked to that is the institutional considerations. So if it's shareholder activism, you spoke about the CSRC and the kind of role it plays. But when it comes to derivative actions, are the courts ready? What are the kind of approaches that the courts are taking? Are they institutionally set up for this purpose? Because that will play an important role, as Holger also mentioned. If you have Elliot coming in, the courts have to be ready to accept something like that. So that would be an important consideration as well.
Thank you. Marco Becht.
I just want to echo what Holger said. It's an equilibrium outcome, and I think that matters for your interpretation. Why is a phone call not enough? Why do you actually observe these cases? So maybe actually the targets are more powerful than you make up, because otherwise a phone call would be enough.
Thank you, Marco. Did I miss anyone? All right. Well, Dan, you have 3 or 4 minutes, but I think the audience does also still want to know about that slide. So I would add that one other question. So please take a few moments to respond and wrap up.
Yeah, so I actually want to go back to the Russian point because in a former life, I was a super junior bag-carrying lawyer on the Yukos-Khodorkovsky international defense. Yeah, and I would suggest that China is not Russia. Yeah, so in that case, at least my experience there was not following, the adherence to rule of law. Yes, but it's almost laughable, right? It's not real often. Yeah, and so that's just my reaction to that. I forgot about that. Holger, you're absolutely right. So I want to be very clear. This is not so. And I misled the audience because I said it's extraordinary because it's ordinary, and I only have the 15, 20 minutes, so I need to unpack it a bit. What I meant by that is the strategies on their face, okay, whether it is director removal or voting against majority of minority proposal, litigation, those tools are ordinary. This system is not ordinary. What is going on here is not a caricature or a replica of activism in the United States. Why isn't Elliot there? Well, if you go to my 2003 paper with Lin, institutional investors, there was capital caps on institutional investors for the first 15 years in China where you couldn't be a foreign institutional investor, even if you wanted to. Okay, so they were frozen out of the market to allow the Chinese institutional investors to develop on their own. This is an entirely different ball of wax, and we've just sketched out some of the interesting stuff, but I completely agree with you. When we unpack this, we're going to find more fascinating things going on here, right? What Jennifer said, Japan, Korea, hopefully we're doing this project, yeah, me and Joon, and I think we'll uncover some very interesting things. The slide, because I don't want to run out of time, and I promised I would tell you which slide it was. Maybe in the interest of time, I won't. Well, I won't go to the slide. I'll just describe it for you, which is I was quite shocked because I thought when they vet my slides, the Jack Ma slide is going to disappear, like Jack Ma. Or I thought, maybe the Xi Jinping, the descendants about him cracking down. I thought those, or maybe the broker butcher would be gone. But it wasn't those at all. It was that in my first iteration, I had that map of the provinces. But in my ignorance, Taiwan wasn't there. And the humble suggestion I got from somebody was, put Taiwan there, or your whole presentation will be about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan, for a superb start to our day. I think we all very much hope that Joon and Gen and Dan will have more for us in the future.